Hello, dream traveler. I am the storyteller, and I'm here to accompany you as you rest tonight. But before you drift into sleep, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? Now take a deep breath, close your eyes, get comfortable, and relax. Let the sound of the rain and tonight's story calm your mind as you slowly drift into sleep. The town that forgot one street. The rain had been falling over the town of Brook Hollow since late afternoon. Not a violent storm, not the kind that rattled windows or flooded streets. Just a quiet, steady rain that softened every sound and wrapped the town in a calm, gray silence. Ethan Walker noticed it as soon as he arrived. He had driven for nearly 4 hours from Pittsburgh, following narrow highways that slowly turned into country roads. By the time he reached Brook Hollow, evening had already begun to settle in. Streetlights glowed faintly through the mist, reflecting off the wet pavement. Brook Hollow was the kind of town where everything seemed slightly slower than the rest of the world. A single grocery store, one gas station, a diner with a flickering neon sign that simply said, "Open." Ethan parked his car outside a small motel and turned off the engine. For a moment, he just listened. Rain on the windshield, wind brushing through trees, the distant hum of tires somewhere far away. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. He had come here for a simple reason. At least, that's what he had told himself. His grandmother had lived in Brook Hollow decades ago. After she passed away, Ethan found an old photograph tucked inside one of her books. On the back, written in careful handwriting, were just 4 words. "Our house on Alder Street." There was only one problem. When Ethan searched the town online, Brook Hollow didn't have an Alder Street. Inside the motel lobby, a small bell rang when Ethan pushed open the door. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. Behind the counter sat an older man watching a small television mounted in the corner. The volume was low enough that it sounded like distant murmuring. The man looked up slowly. "Evening," he said. "Evening," Ethan replied. "Do you have a room for the night?" The man nodded and reached for a clipboard. "Passing through?" "Something like that." Ethan hesitated before asking the question that had brought him here. "Can I ask you something about the town?" The man shrugged. "Sure." Ethan slid the old photograph onto the counter. It showed a narrow street lined with tall trees and small houses. The picture was faded, probably taken in the late 1970s. "My grandmother lived here," Ethan said. "She wrote that it was Alder Street." The man studied the photo for a long moment. Then he frowned. "Never heard of it. You're sure?" "I've lived here 40 years, the man said. "No Alder Street in Brook Hollow." Ethan felt a small knot tighten in his chest, because the photo clearly showed a street sign, Alder Street. Later that night, Ethan sat on the edge of the motel bed with his laptop open. Rain tapped gently against the window. He had already searched every map he could find, Google Maps, old city maps, even scanned records from the county website. Nothing, no Alder Street. But the photograph was real. The houses were real, and Brook Hollow was small enough that every street should be easy to find. Ethan leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Maybe the street had been renamed. Maybe it had been demolished. Or maybe his grandmother had made a mistake. Still, something about the photograph bothered him. The houses looked lived in. Children's bicycles on the sidewalk. A car parked halfway in a driveway. curtains in the windows. It looked like a normal street that no one seemed to remember. Outside, the rain continued falling, steady and soft. And somewhere in the quiet town of Brook Hollow, a street that once existed waited in silence. The rain was still falling the next morning, not heavy, not loud, just the same quiet drizzle that had settled over Brook Hollow the night before. Ethan woke slowly, the soft sound of water tapping against the window filling the small motel room. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then he saw the photograph on the nightstand. Alder Street. He sat up and rubbed his eyes, still feeling that strange curiosity that had followed him all the way to this town. It wasn't just that the street didn't appear on maps. It was the way the motel owner had looked at the picture, confused, almost uncomfortable. Ethan got dressed, grabbed his jacket, and stepped outside. The air smelled like wet asphalt and pine trees. A thin fog hung between the buildings, making the town feel even quieter than before. Across the road, the small diner with the neon open sign was already serving breakfast. Inside, only a few people sat at the counter. An old man reading a newspaper, a truck driver stirring his coffee, and a waitress wiping down the counter with slow, practiced movements. Ethan took a seat. The waitress approached with a small smile. "What can I get you?" "Coffee would be great," Ethan said. She poured it into a thick ceramic mug. Ethan hesitated before pulling the photograph from his jacket pocket. "I was wondering if you could help me with something." She glanced down at the photo, then her smile faded slightly. "Where did you get this?" the waitress asked. "My grandmother," Ethan replied. "She used to live here. She wrote on the back that this was Alder Street." The waitress studied the picture longer than Ethan expected. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the counter as she leaned closer. "That sign," she murmured. "You recognize it?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked around the diner, not suspiciously but carefully, as if checking whether anyone else was listening. Then she looked back at Ethan. "I grew up here," she said quietly. "Brook Hollow isn't big. I know every street in this town. And there's no Alder Street." Ethan sighed softly. "That's what everyone keeps saying." But the waitress didn't look convinced. Instead, she looked thoughtful. "You know what's strange?" she said. "This photo feels familiar." "Familiar how?" "I don't know." She frowned slightly, like when you almost remember a dream. Ethan leaned forward. "So maybe it used to exist?" The waitress slowly shook her head. "If it did, nobody talks about it." After breakfast, Ethan decided to walk through the town. Brook Hollow wasn't large. Within 30 minutes, he had already passed most of the main streets. Pine Road, Willow Lane, Oak Drive, all tree names, which made Alder Street feel even more possible. The rain had softened to a light mist now. Drops clung to tree branches and dripped quietly onto the sidewalks. Ethan pulled up a map on his phone again as he walked. Something caught his attention. At the far edge of town, near a small wooded area, there was a strange gap in the map. Two streets ran parallel for several blocks, Willow Lane and Cedar Avenue, but between them there was an empty strip. No houses marked, no road labeled, just a narrow space where something could have been. Ethan slowed his steps. He looked up from the phone. Ahead of him, past a row of quiet houses, the road curved slightly toward that wooded area. Something about the space between the streets felt wrong, not empty, forgotten. And as Ethan stood there in the quiet morning mist, he noticed something barely visible between the trees, an old metal pole, bent slightly to one side. At the top of it was the faded outline of something that might once have been a street sign. Ethan stepped off the sidewalk and walked slowly toward the trees. The ground was damp from the rain, and small puddles had formed along the edge of the road. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold earth, the kind of scent that only appears after hours of steady rain. From a distance, the metal pole had looked ordinary, but the closer he got, the stranger it seemed. It leaned slightly to one side, as if it had been standing there for many years without anyone bothering to fix it. Rust covered most of the metal, and the edges of the sign were worn and dark. Ethan brushed some of the wet leaves away from the base. Then he looked up. The sign was almost completely faded, but not entirely. Through the rust and peeling paint, a few letters were still visible. L.D. Ethan felt a quiet chill run through him. Alder. This had to be it. He turned slowly and looked behind him toward the houses on Willow Lane. Everything seemed normal. Curtains moved slightly behind windows. A car passed slowly at the end of the street. Life in Brook Hollow continued as if nothing strange existed here. But between Willow Lane and Cedar Avenue, hidden by trees and rain, the entrance to a forgotten street was still standing. Ethan stepped past the pole and walked forward. At first, it didn't even look like a road anymore. Grass had begun growing through the cracks in the pavement, and fallen branches covered parts of the ground. The rain made everything darker, the gray sky blending with the quiet line of trees. But after a few steps, the shape of the street became clear. Sidewalks, driveways, and houses. They stood in a long, silent row, just like in the photograph. Small wooden homes with front porches and narrow yards. Some had broken shutters. Others had mailboxes that leaned sideways as if they hadn't been touched in years. The strangest part was that nothing looked destroyed, just abandoned, like people had simply left. Ethan walked slowly down the middle of the street. His footsteps echoed softly in the quiet. The rain fell through the branches above him, tapping gently against the roofs. He stopped in front of one house that looked almost identical to the one in the photograph. White paint, small porch, 2 windows facing the street. His heart began beating a little faster, because the number on the mailbox read 14 Alder Street, the same number written on the back of his grandmother's photo. Ethan climbed the porch steps slowly. The wood creaked softly under his weight, but the structure still seemed strong. Dust covered the windows, making it impossible to see clearly inside. He tried the door. To his surprise, it opened. The inside of the house smelled like old wood and time. Not mold, not rot, just the quiet scent of a place that hadn't been lived in for many years. The furniture was still there. A couch, a small table, a bookshelf against the wall. Everything looked frozen in place. Ethan walked carefully through the living room, his shoes leaving faint marks in the dust. Then he noticed something on the wall, a framed photograph. He stepped closer. It showed a group of people standing on the same street outside. Children, parents, neighbors, everyone smiling in the warm sunlight of what looked like a summer afternoon. And in the center of the photo stood a young woman. Ethan recognized her immediately, his grandmother. He stared at the image in silence, because behind her, clear and bright in the sunlight, the street sign was perfectly visible. Alder Street, a place that had once been full of life, a place that the entire town now seemed to have forgotten. Ethan stood there for a long moment, staring at the photograph on the wall. The dust in the room softened the light coming through the windows, and the quiet rain outside made the entire house feel suspended in time. Nothing had moved here for years, maybe decades. He stepped closer to the frame. The people in the picture looked happy. Children holding bicycles, a couple standing arm in arm. Neighbors gathered together in the middle of the street like it was the center of their small world. And there was his grandmother, younger than he had ever seen her. Her hair darker, her smile bright and calm. She stood near the front of the group, one hand resting on the shoulder of a little boy Ethan didn't recognize. Everyone in the photograph looked relaxed, peaceful. But the longer Ethan studied the picture, the more something began to feel strange. Not about the people, about the background. Because the houses behind them looked exactly like the houses he had just walked past. Except in the photo, they were full of life. Lights on inside the windows, cars in the driveways, flowers on the porches. A normal street, a living street. Ethan continued walking through the house. In the kitchen, he found old dishes still inside the cabinets. In the hallway, there were framed pictures hanging slightly crooked on the walls. The bedrooms upstairs were small but neat, with beds that still had blankets folded across them. It felt less like an abandoned place and more like a place people had stepped away from, as if they meant to come back. Then he noticed something on a small desk near the window in one of the bedrooms. A journal. The cover was worn and soft with age. Ethan opened it carefully. The handwriting was immediately familiar. His grandmother's. The first pages described simple things. Neighbors, summer barbecues, children playing in the street, quiet evenings on the porch. Alder Street sounded like the kind of place where everyone knew each other. But the entries near the end were different, shorter, uneasy. One of them read, "People in town are starting to avoid this street." Another entry, written a few days later, said, "Something strange happened last night. Lights went out across the whole block. No one can explain it." Then the final entry. The ink looked darker, pressed harder into the page. "They say the town council is going to close the street. Something about safety, but that's not the truth. The truth is, people are forgetting us." Ethan closed the journal slowly. Outside, the rain had begun to soften even more, turning into a light mist drifting through the trees. He stepped back out onto the quiet street. Standing there, it was easy to imagine how Alder Street once looked. Children running along the sidewalks, neighbors talking across their fences, porch lights glowing in the evening. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. Maybe something strange had happened. Maybe fear had spread through the town. Maybe the council had decided the easiest solution was simply to close the street and slowly erase it from memory. Maps were changed. Signs were removed. People stopped talking about it. And over time, the town forgot. But Alder Street itself had never disappeared. The houses remained. The photographs remained. And the quiet memory of the people who once lived there still rested inside those empty rooms. Ethan walked back toward the old sign at the entrance of the street. Before leaving, he looked back one last time. The mist drifted slowly between the houses, and the rain tapped softly against the roofs. A peaceful silence had settled over Alder Street. Not a frightening silence, a resting one, as if the street was simply sleeping, waiting for someone some day to remember that it had once been there. Now, let's move on to the next story. The Last Train to Black Ridge. The rain had started just after sunset. By the time Daniel Harper reached the train station, the entire platform was shining under the yellow glow of old lamps. Water ran along the edges of the concrete, and the distant sound of thunder rolled quietly across the sky. The station was nearly empty. One bench, a vending machine humming softly, and a single train waiting on the tracks. Daniel checked the small ticket in his hand. Black Ridge, last train. He had almost missed it. The train doors were already open, and a faint, mechanical voice echoed from somewhere inside the station. Final departure in 5 minutes. Daniel stepped onto the platform, pulling his jacket tighter around himself as the rain drifted sideways in the wind. He hadn't been to Black Ridge in nearly 15 years, not since he was a teenager. Back then, the town had been quiet and ordinary, just a small place hidden in the mountains, the kind of place where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. But earlier that week, Daniel had received something strange in the mail, an envelope with no return address. Inside, it was a photograph, a picture of the Black Ridge train station, and on the back, written in faded ink, 4 simple words: "You should come back." The inside of the train was warmer than Daniel expected. Soft lights ran along the ceiling, casting a gentle glow over rows of empty seats. The quiet hum of the engine vibrated faintly through the floor. There were only 3 other passengers in the entire car. An older woman sitting near the window, staring out into the rain. A man in a long coat, reading a newspaper. And someone farther down the aisle, their face hidden behind the hood of a dark jacket. No one spoke. Daniel found a seat near the middle of the car and placed his small bag beside him. Outside, the rain tapped softly against the windows. A moment later, the train doors slid closed with a quiet hiss. Then the train began to move. Slowly at first, the platform lights drifted past the window, fading into the darkness of the countryside. The tracks curved gently as the train picked up speed, the rhythmic sound of metal wheels against rails filling the quiet cabin. Daniel leaned his head back and closed his eyes for a moment. He told himself this trip was simple. He would arrive in Black Ridge, look around, try to understand why someone had sent that photograph, and then go home. But as the train carried him deeper into the night, a strange feeling settled quietly in the back of his mind. The feeling that this journey might not be as simple as he thought. Nearly an hour passed. The rain outside grew heavier, turning the windows into blurred sheets of moving water. Occasionally, lightning flickered far away in the clouds, briefly illuminating dark forests rushing past the train. Daniel glanced toward the front of the car. The man with the newspaper had disappeared. The seat where he had been sitting was now empty. Daniel frowned slightly. He was sure the train had not stopped yet. Then the train slowed. The wheels screeched softly as the cars began to decelerate. Outside, dim lights appeared through the rain. Another station, but something about it felt wrong. The platform was small and poorly lit. One broken lamp flickered above a wooden sign. Daniel leaned closer to the window. He tried to read the name, but the rain blurred the letters. The train stopped. The doors opened, and for a moment, no one moved. Then the woman near the window slowly stood up. She walked toward the door without looking at anyone. Just before stepping off the train, she turned slightly toward Daniel. Her expression was calm, almost gentle. "You're going to Black Ridge?" she said quietly. Daniel nodded. The woman gave a small, thoughtful smile. Then she said something that made the quiet train suddenly feel much colder. Most people who take this train don't remember getting there. The train doors closed again with a soft mechanical sound. A moment later, the train slowly began to move. Daniel watched through the rain-covered window as the small station disappeared into the darkness behind them. The flickering lamp faded, then vanished completely as the train picked up speed along the tracks. For a while, the only sound inside the cabin was the steady rhythm of the wheels rolling across the rails. Clack, clack, clack. The empty seat where the woman had been sitting still faced the window. Her coffee cup remained on the small folding table, half full and gently vibrating with the motion of the train. Daniel glanced down the aisle again. The passenger in the dark hood was still sitting in the far corner of the car, completely motionless. The hood hid their face entirely. For a moment, Daniel wondered if the person was asleep or simply staring forward into the dimly lit cabin. Outside, the landscape had changed. The forests looked thicker now, the trees taller and darker. Fog drifted between the trunks, glowing faintly whenever lightning flashed far away in the clouds. Daniel checked the small digital clock above the door, 11:47 p.m. Black Ridge was supposed to be less than an hour away, but something about the journey felt longer than that. The train continued deeper into the night. Occasionally, the lights inside the cabin flickered for just a second before returning to normal. Daniel leaned his head against the window and watched the rain sliding across the glass. He tried to remember the last time he had visited Black Ridge. He had been 17. His family had moved away shortly after that, and the town had slowly become just another memory, something distant and quiet, like a place from an old dream. But there was one thing he remembered very clearly: the train line. Even back then, people in town rarely used it. There had always been strange rumors about the last train of the night. Older residents sometimes joked about it in low voices at the local diner. They would say things like, "That train doesn't always follow the same route," or "Some stations only appear after midnight." Daniel had never taken those stories seriously. Small towns always had their strange little legends. But now, sitting inside the dimly lit train while rain fell endlessly outside the windows, those old conversations returned to his mind in a way that felt less amusing than before. The train slowed again. Daniel looked up immediately. The brakes released a soft metallic screech as the cars gradually came to a stop. Another station appeared outside, but this one looked even older than the last. The platform was made of cracked wooden boards, and the roof of the small shelter leaned slightly to one side, as if it had been damaged long ago. There were no lights, no signs, only the pale glow from the train's headlights cutting through the mist. Daniel leaned closer to the glass, trying to see if anyone was waiting outside. There was no one, just empty fog drifting across the platform. The doors opened. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then something strange caught Daniel's attention. The passenger at the far end of the cabin, the one wearing the hood, slowly stood up. The figure walked down the aisle without making a sound. As they passed Daniel's seat, he noticed something odd. The hooded passenger wasn't looking at the door. They were looking directly at him. Daniel felt a quiet chill run through his chest. The figure stopped beside him. For a moment, the train seemed completely silent. Then a low voice spoke from beneath the hood. "You're still early," the voice said calmly. Daniel frowned slightly. Early for what? The hooded passenger tilted their head just a little, and then they said something that made the quiet train feel suddenly much colder. For the station where this train finally stops, the hooded passenger remained standing beside Daniel for a moment. The dim lights above them flickered softly, reflecting off the wet windows as rain continued sliding down the glass outside. Daniel looked up at the figure, trying to see their face beneath the shadow of the hood, but the angle of the light made it impossible. Only darkness. "You mean Blackridge?" Daniel asked. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, they turned slowly toward the open train doors. The empty platform outside looked quiet and forgotten, with fog drifting across the wooden boards. After a moment, the passenger spoke again. "Blackridge is not the last stop." The voice was calm, not threatening, not emotional, just matter of fact. Daniel felt a strange weight in those words. "What do you mean?" he asked. The figure stepped closer to the door but did not leave the train. "This train," the passenger said softly, "has been running longer than most people remember." Outside, the fog thickened around the platform. The doors remained open, but no one stepped inside. The train doors slowly slid shut again. With a low mechanical hum, the train began moving once more. Daniel watched the hooded passenger walk back down the aisle and sit again in the same seat at the far end of the cabin. The figure remained completely still, almost like a statue. The rhythm of the tracks returned, clack, clack, clack. Daniel leaned back in his seat, trying to make sense of the conversation. Blackridge is not the last stop. The words echoed quietly in his mind. He had looked up the train schedule before leaving home. According to the timetable, Blackridge was the final destination. There were no stations after it, none. Yet something about this train felt disconnected from the normal world. The lights flickered again. Outside, the forest had grown thicker. The trees leaned close to the tracks now, their branches forming dark shapes against the fog. Occasionally, the train passed through pockets of mist, so dense that the world outside disappeared entirely. For a few seconds at a time, it felt like the train was moving through nothing but darkness. Nearly 30 minutes passed. Daniel noticed something strange when he checked the clock above the door again. The display still read 11:47 p.m. He frowned. That couldn't be right. At least half an hour had passed since the last time he looked. He checked his phone. No signal, but the time on his phone read 12:18 a.m. Daniel slowly looked back up at the digital clock. Still 11:47 p.m. At that moment, the train began slowing again, but this time it felt different. The brakes released a long metallic sound as the train gradually reduced speed. Outside, the fog began to thin slightly, revealing something through the mist. Lights. Not the small lights of a rural station, a whole town. Rows of dim street lights appeared along a quiet road that ran parallel to the tracks. Old buildings stood in the distance, their windows dark and silent under the rainy sky. Daniel leaned closer to the window. A wooden sign stood beside the tracks as the train rolled past it. The letters were old, but still visible. Blackridge. The train was finally arriving. But as Daniel looked out over the quiet town he once remembered, a strange realization slowly settled into his mind. The streets were completely empty. No cars, no lights in the houses, no movement anywhere. It looked less like a town where people lived and more like a place that had been waiting for a very long time. The train rolled slowly into the station. Rain continued falling over Blackridge. tapping softly against the metal roof of the platform as the wheels screeched gently against the tracks. Daniel stood from his seat. For a moment, he looked around the cabin. It felt even emptier than before. The seat where the older woman had been sitting was still there, her coffee cup now completely still on the table. The faint warmth from the train lights reflected on the surface of the liquid. Daniel glanced toward the far end of the car. The hooded passenger remained seated, motionless. The train finally stopped. Outside, the platform looked exactly as Daniel remembered it from years ago. Small, quiet, surrounded by tall trees that moved slightly in the night wind. The doors opened with a soft hiss. Daniel picked up his bag and stepped onto the platform. The air outside was cold and damp. The smell of wet wood and rain filled the quiet station. For a few seconds, he simply stood there, listening to the rain. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Daniel turned. The hooded passenger had stepped off the train as well. For the first time, the figure lowered the hood slightly. The face underneath was older than Daniel expected. Not frightening, just tired, like someone who had spent many years traveling. "You made it," the passenger said quietly. Daniel looked out toward the dark streets of the town. "It looks empty," he said. The passenger nodded slowly. "Most of the town left a long time ago." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" The man gestured toward the quiet houses beyond the station. "Blackridge used to be a mining town," he explained. "When the mines closed, people moved away. Businesses shut down. Schools closed." Rain continued falling softly around them. "But the train kept running," the man said. Daniel looked back toward the train. The headlights glowed through the fog, illuminating the empty tracks stretching into the forest. "Why?" Daniel asked. The man gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Because some places don't like being forgotten." The rain began to lighten as the clouds slowly drifted across the sky. Daniel walked a few steps down the platform, looking out over the quiet town of Blackridge. Memories returned slowly. The small grocery store on the corner, the diner where his parents used to take him for breakfast, the narrow streets where he had ridden his bike as a child. All of it still existed, just silent now. Behind him, the train conductor's voice echoed softly from inside the car. "Final departure." Daniel turned. The hooded passenger was already walking back toward the train. Before stepping inside, the man paused and looked back at him. "This train will pass through again someday," he said calmly. "Maybe in a few years, maybe longer." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "And if someone else receives a letter?" he asked. The man nodded. "Then they'll take the same journey." The doors closed. The train slowly pulled away from the station, disappearing into the fog and rain beyond the trees. Daniel stood alone on the platform of Blackridge. The town was quiet, peaceful, and as the distant sound of the train faded into the night, he realized something comforting about the strange journey he had just taken. Some places don't disappear. They simply wait, waiting for someone, somewhere, to remember them again. Now, let's move on to the next story. The strange story of Room 13 at the roadside motel. The rain had been falling for hours when Ethan Carter finally saw the motel sign glowing through the darkness. It was the kind of rain that never seemed violent, but never stopped either. Just a steady curtain of water sliding down from the sky, and washing the empty highway in silver reflections. He had been driving for nearly 9 hours. The road stretched through a quiet region of Pennsylvania where towns appeared rarely and forests pressed close to the asphalt. His headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the rain as the wipers moved back and forth in slow, tired rhythm. That was when the sign appeared. Morris Lake Motel. Several letters flickered weakly, humming faintly in the wet air. Ethan slowed the car and turned into the gravel parking lot. The tires crunched softly as he pulled into a space beneath a dim yellow lamp. There were only 3 cars parked outside the long row of rooms. It looked like the kind of place travelers stopped at once and never really talked about again. Ethan turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the rain tapping on the roof of his car. The silence of the road had been comforting earlier, but now it felt heavy. Still, he was too tired to keep driving. He grabbed his bag, stepped out into the cool night air, and walked toward the small office at the end of the building. Inside, a single lamp lit the room. Behind the counter sat an older man reading a newspaper. The man slowly looked up. The motel office smelled faintly like old coffee and dust. The man behind the counter folded his newspaper carefully and set it aside. He was thin, with gray hair and tired eyes that looked like they had seen the same quiet nights for many years. "Evening," the man said. His voice was calm, almost too calm. Ethan nodded. "Need a room for the night?" The man reached under the counter and pulled out a thick registration book. The pages looked yellow with age. "Room 12 is available," he said. Ethan signed his name while the rain continued tapping gently against the office windows. "You get many travelers out here?" Ethan asked. The man shrugged slightly. "Sometimes." That was all he said. He handed Ethan a metal key attached to a faded plastic tag with the number 12 printed on it. As Ethan turned to leave, the man spoke again. "Just one thing." Ethan paused. "The room next to yours," the man said slowly. "Room 13 is occupied." Ethan nodded. "Okay." "The guest likes quiet," the man continued. Ethan gave a tired smile. "Don't worry, I plan on sleeping." The man studied him for a moment. Then he nodded once. Room 12 was near the end of the building. The rain had softened into a steady whisper as Ethan unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room looked exactly like he expected. Old carpet, a small bed, a dresser with a television that probably hadn't been replaced in decades. The air smelled faintly of detergent and old wood. Ethan placed his bag on the bed and turned on the bedside lamp. For a moment, he simply stood there listening to the quiet. Rain outside, a distant hum from the motel sign, and somewhere nearby, the faint creaking sound of pipes inside the walls. It was the kind of place where every small sound felt louder at night. He took a shower, changed into a t-shirt, and lay down on the bed. The mattress sagged slightly in the middle, but it was comfortable enough. Within minutes, his eyes began to close, but just as sleep started to take him, he heard something. A soft sound from the other side of the wall, room 13. At first it sounded like movement, a chair shifting, or someone slowly walking across the floor. Ethan opened his eyes and listened. The sound stopped. Only the rain remained. He exhaled quietly and turned onto his side. But several minutes later, the sound returned. Slow, careful, as if someone in the next room was walking in circles. Ethan tried to ignore it at first. Motels always had strange noises at night. Pipes shifting, old walls settling, people moving around in nearby rooms. Still, something about the sound felt deliberate, step, pause, step, pause. The pattern repeated slowly on the other side of the wall. Ethan glanced at the clock beside the bed. 1:42 a.m. He sat up slightly and listened more carefully. The steps continued. Not fast, not heavy, just steady movement across the floor of room 13. He imagined another traveler like himself. Maybe someone restless. Maybe someone pacing while talking on the phone or thinking about something they couldn't sleep through. That explanation should have been comforting. But the strange thing was this. He never heard any other sounds. No voice, no television, no suitcase opening, just footsteps. Step, pause, step, pause. The rain outside grew softer as the night deepened. Eventually, the steps stopped again. Ethan lay back down. And finally, after another 20 minutes of quiet, he drifted into sleep. Morning arrived slowly through pale gray light, pushing through the motel curtains. Ethan woke to the distant rumble of a truck passing on the highway. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then the memory of the rain, the long drive, and the strange motel returned. He stretched and sat up. The room felt quiet, peaceful. Whatever he had heard during the night was gone. Ethan showered, packed his bag, and stepped outside. The sky was cloudy but no longer raining. The parking lot looked almost empty. 2 of the cars from the night before were gone. Only one remained. The same old sedan parked in front of room 13. Ethan noticed it as he walked toward the office. It looked like it had been there a long time. Dust coated the windows. The tires looked slightly deflated. That was strange. He entered the office where the same man sat behind the counter. "Sleep well?" the man asked. Ethan hesitated. "Mostly." He considered mentioning the footsteps, but something about the man's expression made him pause. Instead, he said, "How long has the person in room 13 been staying here?" The man looked at him quietly. Then he answered, "A while." Ethan waited for more explanation. None came. The man simply returned to reading his newspaper. After a moment, Ethan nodded politely and stepped back outside. The air smelled fresh after the rain. As he walked toward his car, he glanced once more at room 13. The curtains were closed, no light inside. The old sedan still sat in front of the door. Something about the car bothered him. He walked closer. A thin layer of dust covered the windshield. But what really caught his attention was the license plate. The registration sticker showed a year from nearly 5 years ago. Ethan frowned slightly. Maybe the owner just never updated it. Still, the car looked like it hadn't moved in months. He looked toward the window of room 13. Nothing moved behind the curtain. Then, very faintly, from inside the room, he heard the sound again. Step, pause, step, pause. Ethan slowly stepped away from the door and suddenly realized something unsettling. If someone had been pacing all night, why had the car never moved? Ethan stood beside his car for a moment, staring at the door of room 13. The motel was quiet. The clouds above were thick and gray, and the air still carried the cool smell left behind by the rain during the night. He listened carefully. Nothing. No footsteps now. No movement. Just silence. For a moment, Ethan considered getting into his car and leaving. After all, he had a long drive ahead of him, and the strange sounds from the night before could easily have an explanation. Old motels always had strange noises. But something about that car bothered him. Dust covered the windshield. A thin layer of dirt had collected along the edges of the tires. And when he looked closer, he noticed something else. A small line of dried leaves had gathered near the front wheel, as if the car had been sitting in that exact spot for a very long time. Too long. Ethan slowly stepped back. Then he turned and walked toward the office again. The man behind the counter looked up as Ethan entered. The same newspaper rested in his hands. "You forget something?" the man asked. Ethan shook his head. "Not exactly." He hesitated for a moment. "About the guest in room 13. The man said nothing. Ethan continued. "I heard someone walking around all night." The man slowly folded his newspaper again and placed it on the counter. For a few seconds, he simply looked at Ethan. Then he sighed quietly. "You heard the footsteps?" It wasn't a question. Ethan felt a small chill run down his arms. "You know about it?" he asked. The man nodded slowly. "It happens sometimes." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" The man leaned back slightly in his chair. Then he spoke in a calm, quiet voice. "The man in room 13 checked in many years ago." Ethan blinked. "How many?" The man thought for a moment. 5 years, he said. Ethan stared at him. "That doesn't make sense," he said. "I saw the car outside. It looks abandoned." The man nodded slowly. "It is." Ethan felt a strange heaviness settle in the room. "What happened to the man?" he asked. For a moment, the motel owner didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the small window behind the counter where the empty parking lot could be seen. Then he spoke quietly. "One night, during a storm much like the one yesterday, he never came back." Ethan frowned. "You mean he left?" The man shook his head. "No." He paused. "He simply disappeared." Silence filled the office. Ethan felt a cold feeling spread through his chest. "But every now and then," the man continued slowly, "someone staying in room 12 hears footsteps in room 13. Step, pause, step, pause. The same slow pacing." Ethan swallowed. "And you never checked the room?" he asked. The man looked back at him. "Oh, we checked." He paused. "Every time." The room was always empty. Ethan stood silently in the motel office. The ticking of a small clock on the wall suddenly seemed very loud. "You're saying the room is empty," Ethan said slowly, "but people still hear someone walking inside?" The motel owner nodded. "It doesn't happen every night," he said, "only sometimes." Ethan felt the strange weight of the place settle over him again. Outside, the clouds were beginning to break apart, letting pale morning light spread across the parking lot. Still, something about the motel felt unchanged, as if time moved differently here. "What was his name?" Ethan asked. The owner thought for a moment. "Michael Turner," he said. Ethan nodded slowly. "And no one ever found him?" The man shook his head. "Police came. They searched the lake nearby, the forest, the road." He folded his hands together. "They never found anything." Ethan glanced toward the door. Where he stood, he could see room 13 across the parking lot. The curtains were still closed, and the old sedan still waited in front of the door, exactly where it had been for 5 years. Curiosity is a strange thing. Even when something feels wrong, people still want to know. Ethan stepped outside again. The morning air was quiet and cool. He walked slowly across the gravel parking lot until he stood in front of room 13. The door looked exactly like the others. Same faded paint, same small window. Nothing unusual, but the silence around him felt deeper. Ethan hesitated. Then he knocked. Once. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. The motel owner had followed him outside and now stood several steps away. You won't find anyone in there, the man said calmly. Ethan nodded. I know. Still, he reached out and tried the door handle. Locked. The owner stepped forward and pulled a key from his pocket. Like I said, he murmured, we've checked before. He unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. The room inside was dark and still. Dust floated softly in the morning light coming through the window. The bed was neatly made. The carpet looked untouched. No suitcase, no clothes, no sign that anyone had lived there. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Ethan noticed something. Faint marks on the carpet. A narrow path worn into the fibers of the floor. From the door to the window and back again. Over and over, like someone had walked the same short path thousands of times. Step, pause, step, pause. Ethan felt a cold shiver move through him. Did you ever replace the carpet? He asked quietly. The motel owner shook his head. No. They both stood in the doorway, looking at the faint trail across the floor. Then the owner slowly closed the door again. The lock clicked softly. That's why we keep it closed, he said. Ethan nodded. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ethan walked back toward his car. The sky was brighter now, and the highway beyond the motel was beginning to wake with distant traffic. Before getting inside his car, Ethan turned for one last look at the motel. The quiet row of doors, the flickering motel sign, and room 13. Still closed, still silent. Ethan started his car and drove back onto the empty highway. The motel slowly disappeared behind him as the road curved into the forest. Miles passed. The morning grew brighter, and eventually the strange night began to feel like a distant memory. But far behind him, at the Morris Lake Motel, in the quiet room 13, the carpet remained worn along the same narrow path, from the door to the window and back again. And sometime later that night, in room 12, another traveler would lie awake in the darkness, listening to the slow, careful footsteps. Step, pause, step, pause. These were the 2 bedtime stories for tonight. I hope you enjoyed them. Have a peaceful night. May God watch over you as you sleep. And I'll see you in the next video.